Picture the last time you got a raise, or finally bought the thing you'd been saving for. For a little while, it felt great. And then, pretty quickly, it just became normal. The new salary became the baseline. The new phone became just your phone. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a new target appeared. A little more would be nice. Most people assume this feeling will eventually stop, once they hit some number, some milestone, some version of enough. But what if that number doesn't exist? What if the system itself is built so that enough is permanently out of reach, no matter how much you earn? 2,000 years ago, a group of philosophers, some of them genuinely wealthy, some of them genuinely poor, all arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion about money. And it has very little to do with how much of it you have. Modern psychologists have a name for the pattern we just described. It's called the hedonic treadmill, the idea that improvements in our circumstances produce only a temporary boost in satisfaction, before we adapt and return to our previous baseline. But the Stoics were describing this exact mechanism long before anyone had a name for it. Seneca, who was, by the way, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, wrote extensively about how riches torment their owners more through fear of losing them than they ever satisfy through having them. He wasn't writing as someone who'd failed to acquire wealth and was rationalizing it. He had the wealth. And he was telling people, from the inside, that it didn't do what they thought it would do. Epictetus approached the same idea from the opposite direction. He'd been born into slavery, owned essentially nothing for much of his life, and arrived at a definition of wealth that had nothing to do with possessions at all. He said that the person who isn't satisfied with a little will never be satisfied with anything, no matter how much they accumulate. Notice what's actually being claimed here. It's not that money is bad, or that ambition is bad. It's something more specific and more useful, that the feeling of not enough is not a signal about your bank account. It's a property of how human attention works, and it will follow you to literally any number. So if more money doesn't fix the feeling, what does? The Stoics drew a sharp line between two categories that we tend to blur together: needs and wants. Needs are finite. You need shelter, food, basic security, a small set of things, and once you have them, the need is genuinely satisfied. It doesn't come back an hour later asking for more. Wants are a completely different animal. Wants are, by design, infinite. There is no version of wanting that runs out on its own. You can always want a slightly bigger version of whatever you currently have. Epicurus, often misunderstood as someone obsessed with luxury because of how his name gets used today, actually argued the opposite. He said that what is enough has never been little, meaning that if you frame your life around needs, almost any reasonable circumstance is already enough. The problems start when wants get treated as if they were needs, when upgrading your car, or your house, or your wardrobe starts to feel as urgent and necessary as eating. At that point, you've essentially signed up for an obligation that can never be fulfilled, because the category you've placed it in, want, was never designed to be fulfilled in the first place. This isn't an argument for owning nothing. It's an argument for being honest about which category something belongs to, before you let it run your life. It's worth being concrete about what this looked like in practice, because it's easy to nod along to this idea in the abstract and then go right back to the same patterns. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, with access to essentially unlimited resources, wrote private notes to himself reminding him not to be distracted by, in his words, great possessions. Not because they were evil, but because he'd noticed, from direct experience, that they didn't deliver what people expected. Diogenes, a philosopher often associated with this tradition, took the idea to its extreme, famously living with almost nothing by choice, and reportedly remarking that he had more than the wealthiest man in the world, because he wanted for nothing. That's obviously an extreme example, and probably not the goal for most people watching this. But the principle underneath it scales down just fine. The question worth asking isn't, how do I get more? It's, what would actually change in my daily life if I had less of this specific thing? For a lot of possessions, when you actually sit with that question, the honest answer is, almost nothing would change. The object exists mostly as a kind of background noise, something to maintain, store, insure, or worry about, contributing very little to how your days actually feel. Here's something concrete you can try this week, drawn directly from this way of thinking. Pick one area of your life, your wardrobe, your subscriptions, the apps on your phone, whatever feels manageable, and instead of asking what you should add, ask what you could remove without actually losing anything. Go through it slowly, and for each item, ask the question Marcus Aurelius effectively asked himself. If this were gone tomorrow, what would I actually lose? Not what would I miss out of habit, but what would genuinely change? You'll probably find that a surprisingly large percentage of what you're holding onto, physically or financially, passes this test easily. It can be removed, and your life, your actual day-to-day experience, stays exactly the same. The Stoics weren't anti-money, and this isn't either. Seneca kept his wealth. He just didn't let it convince him it was the thing keeping him safe, or happy, or secure. The goal of this exercise isn't poverty. It's clarity, seeing clearly which parts of your life are doing real work, and which parts are just along for the ride, quietly costing you money, attention, or peace of mind, in exchange for nothing. So here's the core idea to take away from this one. The feeling that you don't have enough yet isn't information about your finances. It's a default setting of human attention, and no amount of income will switch it off on its own. What can change it is a shift in how you categorize what's in front of you, separating the small list of things you genuinely need from the much longer and permanently growing list of things you merely want. The Stoics, whether they were emperors or former slaves, kept arriving at the same place. Contentment isn't found by closing the gap between what you have and what you want. It's found by questioning whether the want was ever something you actually needed to close. Next time, we are going to look at a different kind of difficulty, what the Stoics had to say about fear, and why the things we are most afraid of are so rarely the things that actually hurt us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.